So I am making an Afghan out of several leftovers of fingering weight yarn that I have. Fingering weight yarn is the little tiny stuff, also sock weight yarn that you would use for making socks or anything that you want to have a fine stitch, sweaters, etc. And I just decided that I needed a project that I could just sit down and do that's mindless. Every row I change the color. The yarn that I'm using now is an old Knit Picks palette yarn, and it's old, I can tell, because I keep running into things like this where the yarn has ended from being worn or moth-eaten or just sitting around too long. So I have a trick I use when I get to the end. There will be ends on this to weave in if I decide to, but for now I'm just going to keep knitting, and when I get to the end, see how much I have left. Show how I do it. This is a heather green. It has tones of red in it, so I'm actually going to go back a little bit because I want it to be kind of longer. And now I'm going to take the new yarn, I'm going to cross it with it and fold it in half like this. And I'm actually going to do that over here too. So now I have this, and I'm holding it with my fingers. And holding both together, oops, lost the second part, there we go. Holding both together, I'm now going to knit with the two strands here, and then I'll come up to where I joined them, which is this section, and knit those in there as well. Since this isn't like a stockinette stitch where I would easily see where the doubled yarn is, it would look thicker than the rest, I'm going to go until really the other side just runs out. And if I have any left over toward the end, or not toward the end, when I'm done making the Afghan, I'll snip it right off. But for now, it's going to work, and because the yarn is first moving in one direction and then folded over and moving back in the other direction, when I snip it right at the end of the stitch, I'm not worried about it untangling and somehow creating a hole. So I'll be finishing this row. Every row is knit, which is called garter stitch when you knit every single row. I'm using the Sunset needle tips from Knit Picks, and they are, I believe this is one of their interchangeable needles. I can't remember, because their fixed needles are only, yes, it's an interchangeable needle. Their fixed size needles are only like 0s, 1s, 2s, and 3s, which is great, but I do sometimes want fixed circulars that are longer, so then I have to go get them somewhere else. I actually really like the Knitter's Pride needles with the chrome needle tips. I think they're actually just called chromes. I like those a lot. And at first, when I started this, I joked with my friend, I've done 300 rows and this is how far I've gotten because the yarn is so small. When I started, I was doubling up in the first 5 stitches no matter what, and then I decided that maybe I'll leave the ends. This is the side of the blanket. It's going to be long this way. And I will leave the ends on, but I'll tie a knot between each row and then just cut it. And I think it'll be kind of cool to have a shaggy little end. So, I'm very unprepared to find scissors. So I'm just going to rip it like this with wool. You can do that. And I'll start another color now. This is a leftover, I think it's an Elspeth leveled or silky wool, Elspeth leveled, and I made a buttercup top out of this yarn. by my favorite designer, Heidi Kermeyer. I read that some people get very frustrated with her patterns, but one of the things I love about them is they do beautiful things. Her patterns do beautiful things with unconventional instructions and unconventional structuring, and I really like playing with that. And now I'm just gonna knit a row. This is not my main project. It's not something I'm going to work on every day. It's just something from the mindless days, and to create something that, no matter the combination of colors, I really don't have to think hard. It's going to look very nice. You know, it's like there's too many colors for it to clash, is sort of how I'm thinking of it. And because I'm only doing one row, it's like we're just getting a glimpse of the edge of the color. So the only thing I do try to be careful of as I make this is to not put too many shades of the same color more than 2 rows together. And I thought that I would try to make it all wool, but then I thought that's silly. I mean, there's, one small row of an acrylic yarn is not going to somehow take away from the warmth and, whatever wooliness I was hoping to get when I originally thought I would do it all with wool. And here I am where this is what I had left on the previous row, so I have to remember to just knit the 2 instead of 1. And I think I'll make this video just about 15 minutes. It'll be relaxing. I just like watching people knit. See, in here there's like a little glitter piece that is from an acrylic yarn that I use on some of my dolls when I made dolls. I have a ton of that old eyelash kind of yarn, and I was thinking that every now and then I might throw that in, and over time it would probably get kind of matted and look a little bit like boucle yarn maybe, and I thought that could be pretty fun. I knit Continental style. When I teach knitting, I try to teach them Continental as well. I feel like less movement not only makes it more efficient, but I think it makes it feel like you're more in control of the needles. I use all my fingers, and I tell people when they're learning that once one finger learns something and it becomes by rote, you'll start recognizing another finger that hurts, or another finger that is taking over a new role. It's like they're all trying to help each other get their own role figured out, and then once that finger knows what it's doing, the other fingers are like, all right, who's next? And they all work together to do it right. I remember I went to, in Baltimore, Maryland, I went to I don't want to say it was a stitching bitch, it was like a Saturday afternoon knitting group at a local yarn shop in Baltimore that I had never been to, and I was just starting out. I had been learning for 10 years, and I finally thought that I had gotten it, and I was ready to make something, and I went to a yarn store, and of course that was the first time I saw yarn prices outside of a big anchor craft store, and there was a girl there who was apparently a popular blogger, and she's walking around talking to everybody, very social. She has like a fanny pack on with her yarn in her fanny pack. She was young and talking, and she wasn't looking at what she was knitting, which was a little cardigan for a toddler. I think it was pink. And I'm watching her talk to people, and I'm watching her knit without looking. And I wasn't sure if, it's horrible to admit this, I think, but I wasn't sure if she was bragging about how good she could knit and talking about her blog and that she could knit so well she didn't have to look. And I just remembered it for so long, the knitting without looking. And now I find myself knitting so often in front of a television that I could watch a whole movie in subtitles, and I miss some. But if it's something easy like this where every stitch is a knit stitch, I don't have to look. And I get it now that, that's just, you don't always have to. And although knitting is a very solitary thing, and I find it to be very meditative, I think it also allows you to be very social, because once your body and your hands figure out what you're doing, and you have something like this, you can look up and talk to the men and women across from you. And it's that kind of thing that makes me really look forward to learning more about knitting history. So see, here is where I probably wasn't looking. And it had wrapped around like this instead of going through this blue stitch. So I am going to come behind the blue stitch, pick up the green one, pull that through. It's like I was on the other side of the work, and now I will go through it. So you can fix it when you're not looking and you make a mistake. It's a good thing to do, fixing mistakes, because later you will be very upset that you didn't do it sooner. When I started crocheting bigger things, I think I was 15, and I was fairly new to what was going to end up being my last foster home. Maybe I was 16 actually. And I started working on an Afghan. I was working at Ames, and after every few of my shifts I would buy a skein of acrylic yarn, the Red Heart acrylic yarn, and I decided to make an Afghan. And I made the first skein of yarn. It was about this wide. It was green, I think. And I made it about 10 feet long, not realizing that blankets are not on average 10 feet long. And my mother, my foster mother, who has since adopted me and is amazing, is a seamstress. And she had been sewing clothes and curtains and prom dresses and even wedding gowns. And she saw that I had potentially made a mistake in making it so long, and she suggested that rather than work on a 10-foot long blanket, which would be frustrating and expensive and in the end too long, I should undo what I had done, which was about 3 inches by 10 feet, and start again. And I said, no, that's ridiculous, I'm not doing that. And then after my blanket had gotten about 1 foot long, and it felt like I had been crocheting it for years and years and years, I decided she may have had a point. I was crocheting at least 3 or 4 extra feet in this blanket. So what I ended up doing, instead of taking it out as I should have, is I folded that flap over and stitched it down and made my blanket 6 feet long instead. And I would like to say that ever since I go back when I see a mistake. That's not true, but definitely within the last 5 or 6 years, if I realize that I made another sleeve too long, or I have a mistake 20, 30, 40 rows back, or 500 stitches, I do try to go back and fix it, because I'm not going to enjoy wearing it or giving it if I see that mistake. There's a woman I made a pair of mittens for, and one mitten was a little bit bigger than the other, and it has bothered me ever since. I actually mentioned it to her on Facebook the other day. So this is where I am on the fingering weight Afghan that I'm just doing on the fly. Thanks for knitting with me.